Ilara Voss came into the world on the worst night the village of Morro Cross had seen in 40 years. The fire started in her father's barn at 10:30. By midnight it had taken the grain store, the old cart, and 3 years of her father's savings. By the time her mother pushed her into the world at 2 in the morning, with the midwife's hands shaking and the smell of smoke still pressed into every curtain in the house, the barn was ash, and the village had already begun to talk. She cried the way all new babies cry, loud, confused, unhappy about the cold. The midwife, a stout woman named Agnes Bright, wrapped her in a gray blanket and handed her to her mother. Her mother, pale and exhausted, and 22 years old, looked down at her daughter's face and said, "She is beautiful." Agnes Bright said nothing. She was looking at the mark on the baby's face. A dark birthmark, the color of a bruise that never healed, spreading from just below the left eye and curving down across the jaw. It was not large. It was not disfiguring. It was simply there, the way a river is simply there, a fact of the land. But the barn had burned that night. And Agnes Bright was the kind of woman who needed things to mean something. By morning, the story was already moving through the village the way stories do, from one kitchen to the next, from the well to the church steps, changing slightly with each telling, but never losing its central idea. The Voss baby had come into the world, and fire had come with her. She carried something on her face that God had put there as a warning. She was marked. Ilara's father, Heinrich Voss, was a careful man, a quiet man, a man who spent most of his life trying to offend no one. He heard the stories, and he did not argue with them. He rebuilt his barn with money he borrowed from his brother, and when people in the market looked at him with something between sympathy and suspicion, he looked back with a face that gave them nothing. But at home, in the kitchen, when he thought no one was watching, he would look at his daughter in a way that Ilara, old enough to understand, would later call his apology face. He had never said the words. He had never needed to. His face said them every time he looked at her, for as long as he lived. She grew up between two truths. Her mother's truth, which was that she was beautiful and capable and worth more than any story Agnes Bright could carry to a neighbor's door, and the village's truth, which was that she was trouble, and that trouble was written on her face in a color no soap could wash away. She learned to live inside the space between those two truths. She made herself small in crowds. She paid for things with exact coins, so that no shopkeeper's fingers ever needed to brush hers. She sat at the back of the church, on a chair she brought herself, because she had tried a pew once, when she was 9 years old, and the woman beside her had moved to another seat so quickly that the whole congregation had noticed, and Ilara had spent the rest of the service looking at the floor tiles and counting them. There were 47 tiles visible from her position. She still remembered the number. She became a seamstress because her mother had taught her, and because it was work she could do mostly alone, and because cloth did not flinch when she touched it. She was good at it. Better than good. Her stitches were small and even, her eye for proportion was exact, and she had a particular gift for understanding what a person wanted their clothing to say about them, something she had developed, probably, from years of watching people's faces for information. She had a small room at the back of her mother's house, where she had lived since her mother's death 4 years ago. The room had one window that looked onto a patch of garden, a workbench that ran the full length of one wall, and shelves that held thread in 30 colors, arranged by shade from lightest to darkest. She had arranged them that way herself. It was the only thing in her life she had arranged exactly as she pleased, without anyone's opinion. The village of Morro Cross used her. That was the honest word for it. They brought her their wedding dresses and their mourning clothes and their Sunday coats, and she did the work, and they paid her, fairly, if not generously, and they left. They did not invite her to their homes. They did not stop to speak with her in the street unless they needed something. Their children had been told something about her, something just vague enough that they were not quite cruel, but not quite kind either. They watched her from a distance, the way children watch something they have been taught to be uncertain about. She was 31 years old. She was tired in the way of a person who has been managing other people's discomfort for so long that they have stopped noticing their own. The lane behind the church was the path she used to cross from the east side of the village to the market, because the main road meant walking past the Pemberton house, and Mrs. Pemberton had a talent for finding Ilara on the main road and stopping to speak to her in a voice loud enough for her neighbors to hear. The conversations were always polite, devastatingly, precisely polite, the kind of polite that meant something else entirely. So Ilara took the lane. On a Tuesday morning in late September, she was walking the lane with her basket over one arm and her head slightly down against the wind, thinking about nothing in particular. The blue thread she had run out of, the hem she needed to finish by Thursday, the bread she needed to buy, when the carriage appeared around the bend. It was a very large carriage, dark green, with a crest on the door that she did not recognize, pulled by two horses that were much better fed than any horse she had seen in Morro Cross. It came around the bend too fast for the condition of the lane, and then something happened, a rut, or a stone, or simply the lane's opinion of large carriages, and the left front wheel cracked, and the carriage tilted, and then it stopped. Ilara stopped too. The horses made their feelings clear about the situation. The coachman, a broad man with a red face, climbed down and looked at the wheel, the way people look at things they cannot fix quickly. He said something under his breath that Ilara did not quite hear, and probably did not need to. The carriage door opened. The man who stepped out was not what Ilara had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. He was tall, the kind of tall that made the door frame of the carriage look slightly embarrassed. He was dressed in dark clothing, the kind of dark that was not mourning, but was also not the absence of it. He had gray at his temples, and a face that had done a considerable amount of living, and had stopped trying to pretend otherwise. He looked at the wheel. He looked at the coachman. He looked at the lane. Then he looked at Ilara. She looked back. She had learned not to look away first. Looking away first only made things worse. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." He said, "I don't suppose you know of somewhere nearby where a wheel might be repaired." She said, "Hargreaves, at the north end of the village. He does iron work. He will have the parts." He nodded. Then he said, "Thank you." He paused. "And your name, if I may ask?" People asked her name for two reasons. The first was ordinary courtesy. The second was because they wanted to attach a name to the face, to the story, to the thing Agnes Bright had started 31 years ago. She could not tell, from his face, which reason this was. His face was difficult to read, not closed exactly, more like a book written in a language she did not yet know. "Ilara Voss," she said. "Edmund Hale," he said. He did not add the title. She found out later that he never added the title, unless someone else brought it up first. He looked at her the way a person looks at a painting in a gallery, not rudely, not appraisingly, but with a kind of attention that was trying to understand something. He did not look at the mark on her face specifically. He looked at her face the way he would have looked at anyone's face, which was, in her experience, extremely unusual. "Thank you, Miss Voss," he said. "I will find Hargreaves." He gave a brief instruction to the coachman, and then walked in the direction she had indicated. He walked the way people walk when they are comfortable being alone. No hurry, no performance. She watched him go for a moment longer than was necessary, and then she picked up her basket and walked the other direction, toward the market, thinking about the blue thread. She did not think about Edmund Hale again that day. He thought about the lane for longer than he expected to. He thought about the way the village sat in the valley, and about the cold in the air that was sharper than London cold, and about the woman on the lane who had answered his question and looked at him as if she was waiting to see what kind of person he was going to turn out to be. He found Hargreaves. The wheel was fixed by afternoon. He continued to Ashford House, which he had not visited in 8 months, and which greeted him with the particular silence of a house that had been waiting. He was the Duke of Ashford. He had been the Duke of Ashford for 6 years, since his father's heart gave out at the breakfast table on a Wednesday in March. He had been a widower for 4 years. He had been the only surviving son of the Hale family for 3 years, since his brother William had fallen from a horse in a field that was too wet for riding, in a season when William had not been sleeping well and had been riding too fast to manage the feeling. He had, in other words, spent the last several years absorbing losses. He had gotten rather good at it. Good in the way that you get good at things you have no choice about. Ashford House needed mourning clothes. The household was still in a period of black for William. The appropriate year had not yet passed, and the existing supply was wearing out, as black fabric does, from the frequency of its use. His housekeeper, Mrs. Price, had mentioned it twice, and Edmund had noted it both times and done nothing, because the task had seemed like one more thing in a long list of things, and he had stopped rushing at lists. Now, however, he was here, and the matter was pressing. "Is there a reliable seamstress in the area?" he asked Mrs. Price over dinner that evening. Mrs. Price, who had been with the household since before Edmund was born and had opinions about everything, said, "There is a woman in the village, Elara Voss. Her work is very fine. I have seen her pieces. The stitching is excellent." She paused, in the way that meant she was deciding whether to add something. "The village has some feelings about her, but her work is honest." "What kind of feelings?" Edmund asked. Mrs. Price straightened slightly. "Old ones," she said. "The kind that start before a person is old enough to do anything about them. She was born the night of the Voss barn fire. The village decided long ago that the connection was not a coincidence." Edmund considered his soup. "And is her work reliable?" "It is the best work in 3 counties, Mrs. Price said, with the certainty of a woman who had done considerable embroidery herself and knew the difference. "Then send her a message," Edmund said. "Tell her we need mourning clothes for the full household. Ask if she can come to discuss requirements." Mrs. Price nodded. She did not comment further. She had worked for Edmund long enough to know that when he made a decision, he had already made it, and additional information was welcome, but additional opinions were not. The message reached Elara on a Thursday morning. She read it 3 times. She had done work for houses outside the village before, occasionally, for gentry who needed something specific. But Ashford House was different. Ashford House was the Duke's house. And dukes, in her experience, either did not know she existed or knew she existed in the way the village did, as a story attached to a face. She wrote back. She would come on Saturday at 10 o'clock, if that was acceptable. She would need to discuss fabric weights and the number of garments required before she could give a price. Saturday at 10 o'clock was acceptable. She dressed carefully that morning. Not to impress. She was past the age of dressing to impress people who had already made up their minds about her. but because her work was her name, and the way she presented herself was the first piece of work anyone saw. She wore dark blue wool, simply cut. She pinned her hair back. She brought her measuring tape, her notebook, and her pen. Mrs. Price met her at the servants' entrance, which was where she expected to be met, and led her to a large, quiet room at the back of the house that served as a sort of workroom. There were good windows and a long table and excellent light, which she noticed because light was the most important thing for the work. Edmund Hale arrived 7 minutes later. He came through the door in the same unhurried way he had walked down the lane, and he looked at her for a moment, as if he was confirming something. "Miss Voss," he said, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for the commission," she said. He sat across the table from her, and they began to talk about fabric. It was a practical conversation. He knew what he needed: black wool for the outdoor staff, black cotton for the indoor staff, lighter weight for the summer months still to come. He had a list. She appreciated the list. Most clients came without a list and expected her to guess. She asked about the weight of the wool he wanted. He answered precisely. She asked about buttons, whether he wanted them plain or whether the household had a particular preference. He said plain. She asked about timeline. He said 3 weeks was acceptable if that was reasonable for her workload. She said 3 weeks was fine. She wrote everything down. She took a few preliminary measurements from a housemaid who had been sent in for the purpose. She asked about any particular members of staff who might have unusual requirements. Very tall, very broad, anything that would need extra attention. He answered each question the way he had answered her question on the lane, directly, without looking for anything extra in her face, without pausing to manage his expression. When it was finished, she had 3 pages of notes and a clear picture of what was needed. She named her price. He agreed to it without negotiating, which was not typical but also not suspicious. Some clients simply did not negotiate. She said she would have a first set of samples ready within a week, and could she come back to check the fit? He said yes. She stood. She gathered her notebook and her pen and her measuring tape. She was nearly at the door when he said, "Mrs. Price tells me you are the best work in 3 counties." She turned. "Mrs. Price is generous." "Mrs. Price is not generous," he said. "She is accurate. She considers generosity a form of imprecision." Hilara looked at him. He was sitting at the table with his hands folded, and his face had done a very particular thing. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The corner of his mouth had moved a fraction. She said, "Then I hope I justify her accuracy." She left. In the carriage on the way home, she had borrowed the miller's pony cart for the day. She sat with her notebook in her lap and her hands very still, which was unusual for her, and she thought about the way he had looked at her face. Not at the mark, at her face. She had looked at enough people's eyes to know the difference. She spent the next week working. She cut the black wool at her bench under the window, in the October light that came through at the angle she liked best. She pinned and pressed and stitched with the particular concentration that she had always found more peaceful than anything else. The state where her hands knew what they were doing so completely that her mind was free to do something else, or nothing at all. She thought about Edmund Hale occasionally. She thought about his list. She thought about the way he had answered her questions about buttons, plain, with the speed of a man who had considered it before and arrived at a conclusion. She thought about his hands on the table, folded and still, the way her own hands were still only when they were working. She was not a woman who built fantasies. She had learned early that fantasies cost more than they were worth. The Duke of Ashford was a client. He was a polite and direct client who had not looked at her face the way people looked at her face. That was pleasant. It was not the beginning of anything. It was simply a week's work, and a reasonable payment at the end of it. She told herself this in the mornings while she dressed. She told herself this in the evenings when she put the work down and made her tea. She believed it almost completely. She returned to Ashford House the following Wednesday for the first fitting. The housemaid, a young woman named Polly, who had thick arms and a serious face, and who looked at Ilara with the mild curiosity of a person who had not grown up in Morro Cross, and therefore had no pre-existing opinions, stood still, while Ilara checked the seams and the shoulder line and the fall of the sleeve. Ilara made 3 small adjustments and pinned them. Edmund came into the room at one point to sign a paper that Mrs. Price brought to him. He glanced at the fitting, said nothing, signed the paper, and left. But when he passed through the door he had come in at, he paused and said, over his shoulder, "The wool weight looks right." She said, "I thought so too." He left. Polly watched the door close and then looked at Ilara with an expression that was trying to be neutral. "He doesn't say much," she said. "He says what he means," Ilara said. "Hold still." She came back the following Wednesday and the Wednesday after that. Each time, the conversation was the same, practical, brief, about the work. Each time, Edmund appeared for some period of the visit, sometimes with a reason and sometimes, apparently, without one. He asked about a buttonhole once. He asked about the finishing on a collar once. He asked her opinion about the lining fabric once, in a way that made it clear he was genuinely asking and not performing interest. She gave her opinion. He considered it. He agreed. On the 4th Wednesday it rained. It rained the way October rains in the English countryside. Not dramatically, but with a thoroughness that made the idea of leaving feel unreasonable. Ilara had finished the fitting by midday, and normally she would have said goodbye and gone, but the rain was coming sideways across the grounds, and the miller's pony cart had no cover, and Mrs. Price appeared in the doorway and said that she was to take tea before she went anywhere in this weather, in a tone that did not allow for disagreement. Ilara took tea. Mrs. Price brought it to the library, a room with shelves on 3 walls and a fire that had been lit and was doing its job excellently, and left. And then Edmund appeared in the doorway with a book in his hand and the expression of a man who had been intending to read in the library and had not expected to find it occupied. He looked at the fire. He looked at the rain against the windows. He looked at Ilara, who was sitting very straight in the chair with her cup of tea held in both hands, which was a habit she had and which she was slightly embarrassed about in company. He sat down in the chair on the other side of the fire. He opened his book. She held her tea. The rain continued. After a while he said, "Are you always so still when you're not working?" She said, "I'm usually working." He said, "And when you're not?" She thought about it. "I'm usually thinking about work," she said. He turned a page. "What else?" She looked into the fire. It was a strange question, and he had asked it the way he asked everything, not as a pleasantry, not as small talk, but as if he actually wanted to know. "I read," she said, "when I can get books. The lending library in the next town lets me borrow, if I order a week in advance." She paused. "And I grow things. In the garden. Nothing useful. Just flowers." "Nothing useful," he said. "The useful ones are in the kitchen garden. Those aren't mine. The flowers are just for the look of them." He put the book down on his knee. "What kind?" "Asters, at this time of year. White ones, mostly, because they were here when I came, and I didn't plant them on purpose, but they came back every autumn, and so now, I suppose they're mine by persistence." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife planted roses," he said, "along the east wall. I've kept them, though I know nothing about roses, and they probably suffer for it." He said it very simply, not as a confidence, not as an invitation, more like a fact that had found its way out while he was thinking about something else. Ilara said, "Roses are not forgiving of neglect." "No," he said, "but they are persistent." He picked the book back up. Like asters. She looked at the fire again. Outside, the rain made its sound against the glass. The fire made its sound in the grate. Between those two sounds the room was very quiet, and the quiet was not uncomfortable, which was also unusual. She held her tea with both hands until it was empty, and then she set the cup down and folded her hands in her lap, and she did not apologize for the habit, or explain it. He did not ask about it. When the rain stopped, she left. She drove the pony cart back along the lane in the gray afternoon light, and her hands were steady on the reins, and she thought about roses that were persistent and asters that came back every year without being invited. She thought about his wife's roses on the east wall. She thought about the fact that he had kept them. She was not building fantasies. She was simply noting information. She was very good at noting information. The clothes were finished and delivered at the end of the 3rd week. The household staff received them with quiet approval. Mrs. Price inspected each piece with the seriousness of someone who had promised accuracy and intended to keep her word. "The stitching," she said, after a long inspection of a collar, "is very fine." "Thank you," Ilara said. "The Duke will likely want additional pieces as the household changes," Mrs. Price added, as if this were simply a logistical observation. "I trust we can call on you again." "Of course," Ilara said. She was paid that afternoon. She put the money in the envelope she used for payments and drove the pony cart back to the village. November came. She worked on other commissions. She finished a wedding dress for a farmer's daughter in the next village. White muslin, simple, with long sleeves for the cold. She repaired a coat for the schoolmaster that had been beyond repair 3 times already, but which she did not say, because it was his only good coat. She cut fabric for a dress for the doctor's wife, who had strong opinions about sleeves and had already changed her mind twice. She tended her asters, which were going to seed now in the autumn way. She did not go to Ashford House. On the last Tuesday of November, she was crossing the market square. The main road. She had gone the main road today because she was in a hurry, when she heard her name. It was Mrs. Pemberton. Mrs. Helena Pemberton was 64 years old, the widow of a man who had been a justice of the peace, and the self-appointed moral memory of Morro Cross. She was not a cruel woman, in the way that some people are simply cruel. She was a thorough woman. She had been thorough in her faith, thorough in her household, and thorough in the story she had first heard from Agnes Bright 40 years ago, and had kept alive with a faithfulness that was, in its own way, extraordinary. She was standing at the edge of the square with 2 friends whose names Ilara knew and whose faces she had learned to read. "Miss Voss," she said, in the voice she reserved for public conversations. Warm, clear, carrying. Ilara stopped. "Mrs. Pemberton, I heard you've been up to Ashford House." It was not a question. "I did work for the household," Ilara said. "Mourning clothes. For the Duke." Still not a question. "For the household staff, yes." Mrs. Pemberton's 2 friends were looking at Ilara with identical expressions of polite concern. "I hope you'll be careful, Miss Voss," Mrs. Pemberton said. "The Duke is a man of quality, and men of quality have reputations to consider. One wouldn't want any difficulty to arise for him." There it was, wrapped in a silk that was not silk at all. Elara looked at her. She felt the familiar shape of the thing, the way it was always done this way, in public, in a kind voice, so that if Elara objected, she would seem unreasonable, and if she agreed, she would disappear. "I did the work I was commissioned to do," Elara said. "The stitching was satisfactory." She walked on. Behind her, Mrs. Pemberton said something to her friends in a lower voice. Elara did not turn around. She had stopped turning around for those lower voices when she was 17. But she thought about it, walking home. She thought about it in the way of a person pressing a bruise to see if it still hurts, deliberately, and without much hope. She thought about the conversation in the library. She thought about how it would appear to Mrs. Pemberton, who had made a life's work of appearances. She thought about what the village would do with the information that the seamstress they had called cursed since birth was now visiting Ashford House regularly. She thought about how Edmund Hale, the Duke of Ashford, had a reputation that could be touched by association with her. Whether he knew it or not, whether he had considered it or not, she was quite sure he had not considered it. Men of his position had usually never needed to. She told herself this was fine. The commission was finished. There was no reason to go back. Life would return to the ordinary shape of things, and she would tend her asters and do her work, and take the back lane, and nothing would have changed at all. She believed this. Then Mrs. Price sent another message. The Duke was requesting summer weight fabric for the staff. Would Miss Voss be available to come to the house the following week? Elara sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about what she had told herself. She thought about a chair beside a fire and a rain-wet window, and a man who had kept his wife's roses because they were persistent. She wrote back. She would come the following Wednesday at 10 o'clock. December arrived. She came to Ashford House on 3 more Wednesdays before Christmas. Each time was the same and not the same. The work was genuine work. She was not inventing reasons to visit, and nor, she was quite sure, was he. There were fabric choices to make, and measurements to confirm, and a question about a lining that genuinely required her opinion. The work gave them a reason to be in the same room, and in the same room, things happened that had nothing to do with fabric. He showed her the east wall roses one afternoon, dormant now, their canes tied back for winter. He knew he was not caring for them correctly, he said. She looked at the pruning and confirmed that he was right. She told him what to do in the spring. He listened with the seriousness he gave to information about fabric, which was to say, the seriousness of someone who intends to use what they are told. She told him about the asters, about how they had been there when she moved into her mother's house, and she had assumed they would die over the first winter. But they had not. She had started treating them as an experiment. What would happen if she did nothing? And the answer, 4 years running, was that they came back. He said, "Perhaps that's the best kind of thing, the kind that doesn't need you." She said, "I'm not sure I agree. I think they do better when I pay attention, even if they don't require it." He was quiet for a moment. "You might be right," he said. She did not know if he was still talking about asters. The week before Christmas, she was working at the bench in the back room that Mrs. Price had made available to her. It had better light than anywhere else in the house, she had mentioned once, and the following week the table had been moved to make the most of it, when Edmund came in. He sometimes came in. He had business in that part of the house, or he said he had business. She had stopped trying to determine whether the business was real. He sat down in the chair near the window. There was always a chair. Now, someone had put it there at some point, and he had a letter in his hand. He said, "I had a visitor yesterday." She said, "Oh," and kept her eyes on the work. "Mrs. Helena Pemberton," he said. She set down her needle. She picked it up again. She set a stitch. "She came to advise me," he said, "about the nature of certain local associations and the effect they might have on a person of position." The stitch. Another stitch. The thread was very smooth in her fingers. She had always loved good thread, the way it moved, the way it behaved. "She was very kind," he added, "very thorough." Ilara said, "She usually is." He was quiet. She set 3 more stitches. Outside the window, the December light was thin and pale. "I thanked her for the visit," he said, "and then I closed the door." She looked up then. He was looking out the window. His profile was the same profile it always was. Quiet, precise, not particularly readable. "I sent to London this morning," he said, "for a better chair for this room. The one you've been using has a damaged back leg. I noticed in October. I should have addressed it sooner." She looked at the chair she was sitting in. She pressed her foot quietly against the floor and felt the faint unsteadiness. She had been compensating for it without thinking, for weeks, the way she compensated for many things without thinking. "I had not noticed," she said. "I know," he said. He stood up. The new one should arrive before the new year. He left. She sat with the needle in her fingers, and the thread going slack, and the December light going quieter by the minute. She felt something that she did not have a name for, which was unusual, because she was a precise person who preferred to name things. It was not happiness exactly. It was the shape of where happiness might fit, if she let it. She finished the stitch. She picked up the next one. Christmas came and went. January arrived with frost and a gray sky that stayed gray for 2 weeks without a break. Ilara worked. She finished a coat, started another, repaired a dress for the miller's wife that had been torn in a way that was not, in Ilara's private opinion, consistent with an accident, but which was not her business to comment on. The new chair had arrived at Ashford House before Christmas. Mrs. Price had mentioned it in a brief note, along with a question about the summer weight fabric, and Ilara had written back about the fabric, and not mentioned the chair at all. She thought about it, though. She thought about it the way she thought about things she was trying not to think about, by thinking about them very precisely for a short, controlled period of time, and then putting the thought away. The precise thought was this. Edmund Hale had noticed a damaged chair leg in October. He had not mentioned it in October, or November, or the first 3 weeks of December. He had noticed Mrs. Pemberton's visit, and then, the next morning, sent to London for a chair. The ordering of those things was not a coincidence. She put the thought away. In February, a letter arrived that she had not expected. It came in the Morning Post, not from Mrs. Price, not written in the neat, efficient hand of the housekeeper. The handwriting was different, precise, slightly compressed, as if a large amount of thought had been organized into a small space. It said, "I am aware this is outside the normal arrangement of our commissions. However, there is a matter I would like to discuss in person, if that is acceptable to you. It is not related to fabric. E. Hale." She read it 4 times. She wrote back the same afternoon. She would come on Saturday morning. She drove to Ashford House in the February cold, her hands steady on the reins, her mind doing the thing it did when she was trying not to prepare for something, very busy with unrelated details. The state of the road, a button she had forgotten to order, whether the asters survived frost this deep. Edmund met her himself at the door, which he had not done before. He led her not to the workroom, but to the library, which was where the fire was lit and the chairs were deep, and the rain had trapped them once before. He did not offer an explanation for the change of setting. He poured tea, he handed her the cup, and she held it in both hands, and he did not remark on that. He sat down. "I am going to say something plainly," he said, "because I think you prefer plainness to anything else, and because I have found that I prefer it also." She said, "All right." He said, "I have spent a good deal of the last 4 months in rooms where you also were, and I have found those rooms preferable to any other arrangement of my time. I am aware that this is not a simple thing to say. I am aware that you have reason to be careful, and that caution is a reasonable response to the kind of attention I am describing. I am not asking for anything immediately. I am asking if I may continue." She looked at him. He was looking back. Steady, the way he looked at everything. Not searching for reassurance. Not performing calm. Simply looking. She thought about the lane in September. She thought about the list of buttons and the question about wool weight and the chair that he had noticed in October and addressed in December. She thought about the tea he poured before his own. She thought about a woman who had planted roses and a man who kept them because they were persistent. She thought about 31 years of being very careful. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I was born on the night of a fire," she said. "There is a mark on my face and a story attached to it, and the story has been with me since before I could walk. Most of the people who know my name know the story first. I have learned to live with this. I am not asking for your sympathy about it. But I think you should know it plainly, from me, and not from a woman in a Sunday hat." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know." She said, "You know the story?" "Mrs. Price told me the outline, the first week," he said. "She believed it was information I should have. I thanked her. And I thought about the way you walked into my house," he said, "and measured things with a tape and made notes in a book and charged a fair price. And I thought that a story about a barn fire in the year before I was born seemed considerably less important than the evidence in front of me." She looked at the fire. "You are not my good luck charm," he said. "You are not my redemption. You are not a project." He paused. "You are simply the most precise and interesting person I have met in several years, and I would like to know you better. That is the sum of it." She held her cup with both hands. She said, "I grow flowers for no practical reason." He said, "I know." She said, "I sit at the back of churches." He said, "You may sit wherever you like in mine." She looked at him then, the full look, not the careful sideways glance she gave most people. He looked back without blinking, without the slight adjustment of expression that meant someone was managing how they felt about her face. She said, "I think you should know that I have never trusted easily." He said, "I think I should know that." She said, "And I think slow is better." He said, "I agree entirely." She held her tea. The fire made its sound. Outside, the February light was cold and thin, but it was there. She said, "All right then." He said, "Good." He picked up his book. She finished her tea. She was there for another hour, in the warm library with the fire doing its work, and they talked about his brother William, a subject he had not raised before, but which he raised now, briefly, with the economy of a man who has had time to distill grief into something smaller and more portable. He talked about William the way she had talked about the barn fire, as a fact, placed down, not elaborated. She understood the shape of it. She told him about her mother, one sentence. The phrase she used, her mother's hands, and how she had tried to learn them, did the work of everything else. He did not ask her to explain. She drove home in the pale February afternoon, with her hands steady on the reins and something in her chest that she still did not have an exact word for, but was beginning to stop trying to avoid. Spring came slowly, the way it does in the English countryside. Not suddenly, but as a series of small arguments against the cold. The crocus first, then the mud, then the light shifting back toward something warmer. The asters were not up yet, but they would be. They always came back. She visited Ashford House on Wednesdays and sometimes on Saturdays. The commissions continued. There was always something, and Mrs. Price found something when there was nothing, which Alara was aware of and did not mind. The work was real and good, and she was paid fairly. And in the hours around the work, something else was happening. It happened in the library and in the workroom, and once, memorably, in the east garden where the roses were, and where Edmund had followed her advice from December, with a seriousness that had resulted in roses that were not, this spring, in quite as much distress as they had been before. She looked at his pruning and said it was much better. He said he had thought about what she said regarding attention, that things did better when you paid attention, even if they didn't require it. She looked at the roses. She looked at him. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most of what you say," he said, simply, as if this were a minor logistical detail. She turned back to the roses. She showed him one more thing to do, a cut she had noticed that needed to be cleaner. He listened. He made the cut. She told him it was right. They walked back across the lawn to the house, and the April air was cool and the light was long, and she was aware of the space between them. Not the gap of distance, but the charged thing that had been building since September, since a lane and a broken wheel, and a man who had asked her name and not looked at her face in any particular way. "Are you happy?" he asked, out of nowhere. She looked at the ground in front of her as she walked. "That is a large question." "I know," he said. "You don't have to answer it." She thought about it for a long moment. "I am more content than I have been," she said. "I am not sure about happy. I think I haven't had enough practice with it to measure it correctly." He said nothing. They reached the door. "Are you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I think so," he said. "More than I expected to be, at this stage of things." She went in. She went back to the workroom. Her hands picked up the work and found their rhythm, and she was aware, in the ordinary quiet of the afternoon, that something had settled in her, not all the way, not completely, but more than before. The letter arrived in May. It came with the Morning Post, without a name on the outside, written in a hand she did not recognize. It was 3 sentences long. "The village knows what you are doing. It will not end well for you or for him. Some stains do not wash out." She read it standing at the table. Then she set it down. Then she read it again. The third time she read it, she noticed that her hands were very still, which meant she was controlling them. She had received letters like this before. Not recently, but before. When she was younger. Before she had learned to arrange her life in a way that gave people fewer openings. She knew what letters like this were. They were the village making itself known. They were Agnes Bright's story. 31 years old now, still walking around in people's imaginations. She folded the letter. She put it in the drawer with the bills and the receipts and the paid invoices. She sat down at her bench. She picked up the thread, and she set a stitch, and she set another one. And she did this for 2 hours, and the stitches were very small and very even, which meant she was managing something. Then she stood up, and she went to the wardrobe in her room, and she pulled out the case she kept there. Old leather, worn at the corners. She had packed it before. She was very good at it. Her hands knew the order of things without thinking. She packed the 2 dresses she wore most. She packed her good needles and her personal thread and the small book she kept her patterns in. She packed the photograph of her mother, which was the only photograph she owned. She packed these things with an efficiency that came from practice and not from calm. She went back to the workroom and looked at the chair Edmund had sent from London. The new chair, with the solid legs and the good seat. It sat under the window in her workroom, where she had moved it when she no longer needed to bring the measuring tape to Ashford House. She looked at it for a long time. She sat down in it. She did not pack another thing. She sat in the chair with her hands in her lap, and she let herself think, very clearly, about what the letter was and what it was not. It was not the truth. It was not a warning about something real. It was the village's last available instrument. A piece of paper, 3 sentences, anonymous. The handwriting might have been anyone's. The feelings behind it had been there since the night of the barn fire. She was not afraid of it. That was the clearest thought she had. She was tired of it, the way you are tired of weather that has gone on too long. But she was not afraid. She was afraid of something else. She was afraid of what it would cost him. She was afraid that she had spent 31 years being someone's bad luck story, and that she might become his, not because she was, but because enough people believed it, and belief was a force that did not require facts. She sat in the chair until the light in the room changed, which meant the afternoon had come. Then she heard the pony cart on the road outside, and she realized she had forgotten that she had borrowed it for the day. She went to the door. He was there. Edmund Hale was standing in the lane outside her mother's house, which was now her house, and he had come on horseback, which meant he had come himself and not sent a message. He was in riding clothes, without ceremony, and his hair was slightly disordered from the ride, and he was looking at her door with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and is not entirely certain of his welcome. She opened the door. He looked at her. He looked at her face, and at her hands, which were visible and which were giving something away in the way hands do when they are not holding anything. He looked at her standing in the doorway of a house with a packed case behind her somewhere, and his face did the thing it did when he understood something. He said, "I heard about the letter." She said, "I haven't told anyone about a letter. Mrs. Price has lived in this village for 40 years, he said. She knows things before they happen. Ilara looked at him in the lane. The May afternoon light was the kind of light that is kind to everything it touches. It doesn't matter, she said. The letter. I know it doesn't, he said. I came because I thought you might be standing somewhere in your house, convincing yourself of something. She looked at the lane. A cat from next door crossed it with the indifference of cats and disappeared into the garden. I was convincing myself, she said, that it would cost you something, being associated with me, that it would damage something. He was quiet for a moment. Do you want to know what I think? She said, yes. He said, I think that people have been telling you what you cost for so long that you have started to believe you are a cost. You are not a cost, Ilara. He said her name the way he said everything, without decoration, but with complete attention. You are what the last 8 months have felt like. You are the most clear-sighted person I know, and I am not a man who makes his decisions based on what a letter without a name on it requires of him. She looked at him in the lane. His horse had lowered its head and was inspecting the grass at the verge with interest. She said, I packed a case. He said, I know. She said, I didn't finish packing it. He said, I know that too. The lane was quiet. And down toward the church, Someone's chickens were having opinions about something. The May light sat on the rooftops and the hedges and the lane with equal patience. She said, "I'm going to need you to be very clear with me, all the way, because I have very little experience with people who mean what they say." He said, "I mean what I say." She said, "Every time." He said, "Every time." She nodded once. She looked back at the door of the house. She thought about the case in the bedroom. She thought about the chair under the window. She went back inside. She went to the bedroom. She unpacked the case. She hung the 2 dresses back where they lived. She put the needles and the thread back on the shelf. She put the photograph of her mother back on the table by the bed. She did this carefully and completely. Then she went back to the door, and she opened it, and he was still there, in the lane, with his horse at the verge and the afternoon light on his face, and the particular expression that she was beginning to learn, the one that was not quite a smile but was close enough that it served the same purpose. "I will come Wednesday," she said. "Wednesday," he said. He turned his horse. He rode back the way he had come, down the lane, in the May afternoon, and she watched him go the same way she had watched him go on the very first day, in September, when she had watched him for a moment longer than was necessary, and then made herself stop. This time she did not make herself stop. She watched until the lane bent and he was gone around the bend, and then she went inside and put the kettle on, because it was that time of afternoon. Summer arrived. The asters came up in the garden, white, reliable, unasked for, exactly as they had come up every year. She cut some and put them in a jar on her bench. She cut some more and brought them to Ashford House and put them in the workroom, and nobody said anything about it, but they were there. The commissions continued. There was always something to do at Ashford House, which she had stopped questioning. She was paid for every piece of work, fairly, and she was respected in the house. And Polly, the housemaid who had first been fitted, had started bringing her tea without being asked, which was the kind of small kindness that Alara accepted without making a fuss. She and Edmund talked about many things, now, not only fabric and gardens, about books. They had read some of the same ones, and agreed about some and disagreed about others, and the disagreements were the most interesting conversations. About his time before Ashford, when he had worked in his father's legal practice because his father had believed that a man of any position should understand work. About her early years with her mother, learning to sew by lamplight, the way her mother had made it seem like the most normal thing in the world to make something from nothing. He told her about William, more than one sentence now, more than the distilled version. He told her about who William had been, which was a man who was quick to laugh and slow to hold a grudge, and who had been, in many ways, more fitted for the life they had been born into than Edmund himself. He said this without self-pity, simply as an observation. She told him about her father, 2 sentences, the barn fire and the apologies. He listened without asking her to say more, which was exactly right. In August, he asked her to stay for dinner. She said yes. It was the first time she had eaten at Ashford House, in the dining room with the long table. Mrs. Price served the meal with complete normality, as if this were an entirely expected event, which told Alara that it had been expected, at least by Mrs. Price. They ate and talked, and the evening came in through the tall windows, and the candles were lit at some point, and neither of them particularly noticed, because they were in the middle of a discussion about whether patience was a virtue or simply a form of stubbornness with better manners. She said patience was stubbornness with a longer view. He said that was exactly what it was. When she left, late, In the pony cart, with a lantern hung at the front, she was aware that the day had been a large one, that something had shifted to a place it had not been before. She drove home in the dark, with the lantern making its small circle of light on the road ahead. She thought about the 31 years before September, and the 8 months since September, and the difference between them. The difference was not exactly Edmund. The difference was that she had stopped walking, like a person who expected to be moved out of the way. She had not noticed herself stopping. It had happened the way asters happen, by returning, year after year, until they were simply part of the landscape. September came around again, and with it, the anniversary of the lane, which neither of them mentioned and both of them knew. He asked her to marry him on a Wednesday afternoon, not in the library, not in the workroom, on the lane itself, the same lane, the same bend where the carriage had stopped a year ago. He had suggested a walk after the work was finished, which was not unusual, and she had put on her coat, and they had walked out of the grounds and down through the field and out to the lane. He stopped at the bend. She stopped beside him. He said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer is yours entirely. I am not asking you to become something different. I am not asking you to manage anyone's opinion or to become comfortable with anything you are not comfortable with. I am asking because the last 12 months have been the most inhabitable year I have had in a long time, and I believe this is because of you, and I would like the next years to be arranged the same way." She looked at the lane. The October light was the same as it had been a year ago, thin, slanted, making the hedges look like they were made of something more serious than hedges. He said, "Will you marry me?" She looked at him. She thought about 31 years of being someone's bad luck. She thought about a mother who said she was beautiful. She thought about a father's apology face. She thought about the chair with the solid legs and the tea poured first. She thought about the letter in the drawer, with the invoices and the way she had not finished packing. She thought about what it meant to be certain. She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He did not say it lightly. He said it the way he said everything, with the complete weight of what he meant behind it. Good, meaning, I was certain, and now you have confirmed it, and I will not forget this afternoon for the rest of my life. She was quite sure, from his face, that this was what he meant. They walked back to the house. Mrs. Price met them in the hall with a composure that was slightly too composed to be entirely natural, and Elara understood that Mrs. Price had known about the afternoon's plan and had chosen, for once, to be something other than accurate, and instead to be pleased. The wedding was in December, small by the standards of a duke's wedding, which meant that it was still a great deal larger than anything Elara had ever imagined for herself. There were 40 people in the church, family she had not known Edmund had, a few old friends, the household staff. Mrs. Pemberton was not there. Elara had not expected her to be. She wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool, very simple, with long sleeves for the cold. She had made it in the evenings over 3 weeks, in the workroom at Ashford House, on the bench under the window. Mrs. Price had watched her work on it twice and said nothing both times, which was Mrs. Price's equivalent of admiration. She stood at the front of the church, and she did not sit at the back on a chair she had brought herself. She stood where she was meant to stand, in the place that was hers, and when the ceremony was over and she turned to face the room, she looked at 40 people and held the look without looking at the floor. She found that she could. She found that she had been practicing for this, in small ways, for 12 months, every time she had looked at Edmund Hale, and he had looked back, and nobody had needed to move to a different chair. They went to Ashford House. The east wall roses were sleeping under their winter covering. The asters in the garden had gone to seed. In the spring, she had already decided she would plant more flowers, not because they were useful, but because there was garden enough here for many useless things, and she intended to use it. The household settled around them. The months moved the way months do when they contain ordinary things: work and dinner and disagreement and morning tea, and a man who kept his word every time, and a woman who was slowly learning what it meant to believe that. In the second year of their marriage, Ilara was expecting a child. She was not afraid, exactly. She was careful. She was careful in the way of a person who has learned that care is not the opposite of hope, but simply the shape that hope takes in a person with good sense. The child was born on a night in late April, a clear night, cold and still, with a sky that was simply a sky. No fire, no omens, no stories. A girl. Dark hair. Very loud feelings about the cold. Edmund sat beside Ilara's bed and held her hand. He had been there the entire time, which she had not asked for, and which he had not announced. He was simply there, the way he was simply anywhere, when it was the right place to be. She looked at her daughter's face. No marks, no stories attached yet. A blank beginning. She thought about what it would mean to raise someone from the beginning, without the weight of a story told about them before they could talk back. She thought about what she would tell this child, about her own face and her own beginning, and the village on the hill. She thought she would tell her when she was old enough. She would tell her in the way her mother had told her, as a fact, with love on both sides of it, without apology. And she would tell her the second half of it too, which her mother had not lived to see. The village, of course, tried. The letters began within a week of the birth. Anonymous again, because they were always anonymous. They went from the post to Edmund's desk, where he read them. She knew he read them, and from his desk they went to a drawer in the estate office. She found out later, much later, that he had labeled the drawer. She found it when she was looking for a document about the estate accounts. Years after, when Edmund was traveling and she was managing things while he was gone. The drawer was ordinary, the second drawer in the left cabinet. She opened it, expecting to find ordinary things. Inside, the letters were sorted neatly. There were more of them than she had known about. Years of them. The ones from before their marriage, and the ones from after, and the ones that had come when the baby was born, and the ones that had come when the baby had been baptized, and the ones that had come for other reasons she could not always identify. They were organized chronologically. Each envelope was there, unopened after the first reading, or sometimes still sealed. Above them, in Edmund's handwriting, precise, slightly compressed, organized, was a single label on a piece of cream cardstock, pinned to the inside of the drawer. Irrelevant. One word. She stood in the estate office for a long time with the drawer open. Then she closed it. She went to the window and looked out at the east wall, where the roses were. They were in good condition now. 3 springs of proper attention had made them better than they had been in years. They were persistent, and they did better when someone paid attention, and both of these things were true at the same time. She thought about Elaine in September, a broken wheel, a man who asked her name before he looked at her face. She thought about 31 years of being someone's bad luck, and the years since, and the drawer labeled the way it was labeled, and the daughter who was sleeping at this moment in the room upstairs, with her dark hair and her loud opinions, and her whole blank, unwritten future. She had spent 31 years being someone's bad luck. It turned out she had been someone's whole good fortune. The math had always been someone else's error. She went back to the accounts. She found the document she needed. She did the work that wanted doing, in the long, ordinary light of an afternoon that asked nothing of her except that she be there for it. She was there for it. That, in the end, was what the story came down to. Not the fire, not the mark, not the letters in the drawer. Just a woman who had stayed, who had learned to stay, who had been given, by patient and accumulated evidence, a reason to believe that staying was worth the cost. She stayed. She stayed every single day after that. And the asters came up in the garden every autumn, white and persistent, unasked for, and she tended them anyway, because things do better when you pay attention, even when they don't need you to, even when they would come back regardless. Even then. She learned this from asters first, and later from roses, and later still from a man who had kept a labeled drawer for years and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of eloquence. The village went on being the village. People grew old. The next generation inherited opinions without always knowing they had been inherited. Agnes Bright died in the spring of Alara's 3rd year at Ashford House, at a great age, and Alara did not go to the funeral but sent flowers, white asters, because they were what she had, and because she held no particular anger toward a woman who had simply done what frightened people do. Mrs. Pemberton lived for many more years. She saw Alara in the village occasionally, because Alara did not stop going to the village. She went on the main road now, without detours, and if Mrs. Pemberton was at her window, and she frequently was, then they occasionally nodded to each other, in the way of people who have understood each other's position for a long time and have settled into a silence that is less hostile than simply final. Edmund continued to be exactly who he had been on the lane in September. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make large speeches or grand gestures. He noticed things, the way a seam was sitting, the angle of the afternoon light on the workbench, the week in October when Alara's hands had been less steady than usual, because she had been unwell and had not mentioned it. He noticed and he acted on what he noticed, without ceremony, without requiring acknowledgement. She noticed him noticing, and she acted on that too, in her own way. She asked him once, late in their 2nd year, when they were sitting in the library, in the way they still sometimes sat in the library, him with a book, her with the work that she had never stopped bringing home to finish in the evenings, because she liked the evenings and she liked the library. She asked him when he had decided, about her, when he had known. He put down the book. He thought about it with the seriousness he gave to genuine questions. He said, "On the lane, when you told me where to find Hargreaves, and then you didn't wait to see what I thought of you for it. You just walked on." She said, "I walked on because I had bread to buy." He said, "I know. That was exactly it." She looked at him. He picked up his book. She looked at her work. She set a stitch. The fire in the grate made its quiet sound. Outside the window, the autumn dark had come down early, the way it does in October, and the house was warm, and the light was good, and the work was going well. She set another stitch, and another, small and even, the way they always were, each one placed exactly where she intended it. Nothing wasted, nothing extra, just the clean line of a thing done as well as it could be done. She had been born on the night of a fire. She had grown into a woman in the space between other people's stories about her. She had walked into a room and measured it precisely. Exits, light, the particular quality of a stranger's attention, and she had been right about what she found there. She had stayed. Outside, the asters were done for the year, gone back to their roots to wait. In the spring they would come up again. They always did. White and ordinary and stubborn and entirely worth the space they took. She had learned, slowly and at some cost, to think of herself the same way. She thought, sometimes, about what Agnes Bright had seen on the night of the fire. A baby with a mark on her face, and a barn gone to ash, and two things that happened at once. And how a different kind of woman might have looked at those same two things and seen something else entirely. Might have said, "Look, a child born on the worst night of her father's life, and still she cried, and still she breathed, and still she opened her eyes in the morning." Might have said, "There is a family here, diminished by fire and made, in some way, stronger for what they had to rebuild." But Agnes Bright had seen what she had seen, and the village had believed what it had believed, and Alara had grown up inside a story she had not written. She had not been able to change the story's beginning. She had not been able to choose the face she wore, or the night she had arrived in the world, or the particular combination of bad luck and fire that had given the village its conclusion before she was 24 hours old. What she had been able to do was continue. She had continued on every Wednesday and every market day and every Sunday morning in her own chair at the back of the church, and every season when the asters came back, and every year when the accounts were settled, and every morning when she opened the workroom window to let in the light. She had continued so steadily and for so long that continuing had become, without her noticing, a kind of answer to the story. Not a refutation, not an argument, simply a counter-evidence that had accumulated over 31 years until it outweighed the original claim by so much that the claim began to seem like what it had always been, a frightened person's explanation for a fire that had had nothing to do with a baby. Edmund had seen the counter-evidence immediately. That was the thing she had come to understand about him over years. He was not a man of faith or superstition. He was a man of evidence. He had looked at the evidence of her hands and her work, and the way she walked into a room and measured it, and he had reached a conclusion, and the conclusion was the opposite of the one the village had reached. He had been right. She thought he knew he had been right, in the quiet, matter-of-fact way that he knew most things. She was grateful for him in a way she was not sure she knew how to say, and she thought possibly she did not need to say it, because he noticed most things, and he had almost certainly noticed this too. Their daughter grew. She was a child with strong opinions and a curiosity about everything, and a habit of asking the same question repeatedly from slightly different angles, which Edmund said she had inherited from her mother and which Alara denied, and which was entirely true. She was called Ada, not a family name, not an inherited name, simply a name that had seemed, when they said it in the delivery room, to belong to her. She had looked up at her parents with the unseeing clarity of newborns, and her father had said quietly, "Ada," and Alara had agreed. Ada grew up knowing about the story. Alara had told her when she was 6, sitting in the garden by the asters, in simple words without drama. There had been a fire. People had told a story about it. The story was not true. Some people in the village still believed it, because people sometimes hold on to stories longer than the stories deserve, and that was something to understand about people without being too angry at them. Ada had looked at her mother's face, the mark, familiar as morning by now, and said, "But why did they blame you for the fire?" "You were a baby," Alara said, "because people who are frightened sometimes need an explanation, and the nearest explanation is not always the correct one." Ada thought about this for a long time, in the way she thought about everything. Then she said, "That's not very logical. No, Elara agreed. It isn't. Ada went back to pulling up grass. Then she said, Papa says you are his greatest blessing. Elara looked at the asters. He says that, she said. He said it to Mr. Lawson, Ada reported, with the precision of a child who had inherited her father's habit of listening. Mr. Lawson asked Papa how he had been keeping, and Papa said he had been very well, and that you were his greatest blessing. And then they talked about the water drainage in the lower field for a long time, which was very boring. Elara looked at the garden. The afternoon light was on the asters, and on the grass, and on her daughter's dark hair. She thought about a man who kept his word, and kept his wife's roses, and labeled a drawer, and poured tea in a particular order, and who had, apparently, told Mr. Lawson something about a drainage field and a blessing in the same conversation, without making anything particular of it, because he was not a man who made particular things of what he simply believed. She thought, they called her cursed since birth. He called her his greatest blessing. She had spent 31 years as the first thing. She would spend the rest of her life as the second. The asters grew. Ada grew. The roses on the east wall were better every year. Elara continued. She had always been good at continuing.